When you hear the word Viking, what comes to mind? Maybe it's huge, bearded warriors charging into battle with axes. Maybe it's ships with dragon heads, slicing through the cold sea. Or maybe it's the idea of brave explorers sailing into the unknown. But what if I told you the true story of the Vikings is far darker than all that? What if I told you that behind the legends, the real Vikings did things so cruel, so twisted, that they were whispered about in fear for centuries? This isn't about battles or wars. This is about what happened after the battles. The things they did to their enemies when the swords were put away. Things so horrible, most history books don't go into detail. You're about to hear what they really did. And once you know, you'll never look at Viking history the same way again. This video goes deeper than usual. We're not just talking about Viking raids and conquests. We're breaking down the methods they used to strike fear into the hearts of everyone they met. You'll learn about the torture techniques that turned grown men into begging wrecks, how they turned religion into a weapon, why the Vikings didn't need to fight to win. They let fear do the work, and the twisted rituals they used to make sure their enemies were not just defeated, but erased. By the end of this video, you'll have a full picture of why Viking terror lasted for hundreds of years. So stay with me. Let's uncover the part of Viking history no one talks about. Part 1. Who were the Vikings, really? Before we dive into the brutal stuff, we need to understand who the Vikings really were. Because the truth is, most people get them wrong. When people hear the word Viking, they often imagine a single group of people, like a tribe or a nation, but that's not exactly right. The word Viking wasn't originally used the way we use it now. Back then, going a Viking meant going on an expedition, usually one that involved raiding or trading. So being a Viking wasn't about who you were. It was about what you did. Most Vikings came from what is now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. That whole region was called Scandinavia. And life there? It was tough, cold winters, short growing seasons, rocky soil. So while some people farmed or fished, many turned to something else. The sea. Vikings became expert sailors. They built longships, narrow, fast boats that could cross oceans and rivers. These ships could carry warriors deep into foreign lands. And once they landed, that's when things got brutal. At their height, Viking warriors traveled far beyond their homelands. They reached England, Ireland, France, Spain, Italy, even parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Some Vikings even made it all the way to modern-day Russia and Ukraine. Others sailed west and discovered Iceland, Greenland, and, yes, even North America, centuries before Columbus. But no matter where they went, they brought fear with them. Because Vikings didn't just fight. They didn't just invade. They terrified people, broke them, humiliated them, and in many cases, they made sure their enemies never recovered. Part 2. The Blood Eagle, what it was and why it scared everyone. Let's start with the most famous and feared Viking punishment of all, the Blood Eagle. Even the name sounds terrifying, and what it supposedly involved. It's the kind of thing you hear once and never forget. Now, I'll be straight with you. Historians still argue about whether the Blood Eagle actually happened the way the legends say. But here's the important thing. The people at the time believed it did, and that belief alone was enough to create fear. So what was it? The Blood Eagle was a form of execution. Not just any execution, an incredibly painful, drawn-out, theatrical one. Here's how the story goes. An enemy of the Vikings, usually someone high-ranking, like a king or noble, would be captured. Instead of killing them quickly, the Vikings would begin a ritual. They would tie the person face down. Then, using knives and axes, they would cut through the ribs from the back, one by one, carefully, brutally. After that, they would break the ribs outward, pulling them open to resemble wings, as if the person had grown wings from their back. But it didn't stop there. The final part? They would pull out the lungs and place them on top of the ribs, like feathers. Some stories say the person was still alive during the process, conscious, screaming, suffocating their own blood. Why would they do something so awful? Simple. Fear. The Blood Eagle wasn't about punishment. It was a warning, a message. It told everyone watching, If you betray us, this is what will happen to you. One of the most famous cases involved a man named Aella, a king of Northumbria. He killed a Viking leader, Ragnar Lothbrok, and Ragnar's sons came for revenge. According to legend, they captured Aella and performed the blood eagle on him. Now, again, we don't know if it really happened, but the fear was real. Stories of the blood eagle spread fast, and the more people heard about it, the more they gave up without a fight. That's what made it such a powerful weapon. Even if it didn't happen often, or at all, the idea of it worked. It made people afraid to even resist. Part 3. Raiding the Sacred. Why churches were targeted first. In most of medieval Europe, there was one rule in war: leave the churches alone. Churches and monasteries were sacred, holy, protected. They were seen as places of peace, even during violent times. But the Vikings didn't care. In fact, they saw churches as easy targets. And they were right. Most churches were full of treasure, gold and silver objects, jewel crosses, manuscripts written on expensive parchment. And the monks? They weren't fighters. They were quiet men focused on prayer. So when Viking ships showed up, churches became one of the first places they hit. The most famous example is a raid on Lindisfarne in the year 793. Lindisfarne was a monastery on a small island off the coast of northern England. Peaceful, isolated, unarmed. On June 8, 793, Viking ships appeared on the shore. The warriors stormed the monastery. They killed some of the monks, kidnapped others, stole everything valuable, then burned the place. This shocked everyone, not just in England, but across Europe. The idea that someone would attack a holy place like that, it was unthinkable. People were horrified. They thought it was the end of the world. From that point on, Viking raids became a regular fear, and churches were no longer safe. It wasn't just about the money. The Vikings knew that by attacking religion, they were hitting people where it hurt the most, spiritually. They sent a clear message: your God can't protect you, but we can destroy you. That kind of attack didn't just cause pain, it caused panic. Part 4. Torture as a tool, not just pain, but power. Vikings didn't torture just because they were violent or cruel. Though, let's be honest, some of them clearly were. They used torture as a tool, a strategy, a way to control people, without needing to fight a battle every time. Torture sent a message, and in the Viking world, messages mattered. Let's look at some of the ways they tortured enemies, and why it worked. Sometimes, they would mutilate a person before killing them, cut off fingers, cut out tongues, burn parts of the body while the person was still alive. These acts weren't just meant to cause pain. They were designed to break someone's mind, to make them fear what came next. One method was flaying, removing skin from a living person, usually starting from the back or the chest. If done slowly, the victim could stay alive for hours. Another was impalement, forcing a sharpened stake to the body and letting the person hang there, slowly dying. The pain was bad, but the fear it created in the people who saw it, that was the real goal. The Vikings were also known to hang bodies from trees or city gates after battles. Sometimes they left the corpses for days, sometimes weeks. This wasn't about disrespect. It was about making everyone in the area terrified. If a town saw their neighbors' leaders hanging like that, they knew what was coming. And next time, maybe they'd surrender before fighting. Even when they didn't kill, they humiliated. Some Viking warriors would cut off ears or noses of captives and let them go. Why? Because every time someone saw that person walking around, scarred, broken, afraid, it reminded them of Viking power. In other words, torture wasn't just about hurting one person. It was about sending a signal to thousands. Part 5. Killing for status, not just survival. For many Viking warriors, killing wasn't just part war. It was part of identity. In some Viking stories, warriors didn't just fight to win battles. They fought to build their reputation. The more brutal the kill, the more respect you earned. If you died in a glorious way, in battle with honor, you were believed to go to Valhalla, the Viking warrior heaven. A great hall where you'd feast, drink, and fight forever. Sounds intense, right? That belief shaped their actions. Dying in bed from old age? That was seen as weak. But dying with a sword in your hand? That was something to be proud of. There's a Viking phrase, better to die with honor than to live with shame. And they meant it. Some Viking champions, called berserkers, were even known to go looking for fights. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Every kill was another story, another legend. There were also duels called home gangs, one-on-one fights, often over honor, land, or leadership. These fights were often deadly, but they were accepted, even respected. And in battle, the Vikings didn't care much about mercy. They would wipe out entire villages, kill all the men, take the rest as slaves. Not always because they had to, but because it made them feared, and being feared gave them power. To the Vikings, killing wasn't just a means to an end. Sometimes it was the goal. Part 6. Slavery. Turning enemies into property. When people think of Viking raids, they often picture gold and treasure. But the most valuable thing the Vikings took? People. Slavery was a huge part of Viking society. After a raid, they didn't just loot. They took captives, sometimes entire towns, and brought them back to Scandinavia as thralls, their word for slaves. And this wasn't rare. Some Viking settlements had more slaves than free people. Who got taken? Anyone who could be caught. Men were forced to work in fields, mines, or workshops. Women were made to cook, clean, and more often than not, were sexually abused. Children were taken young and raised as servants, or sold at markets far from home. And the Vikings didn't just keep these people, they traded them. There were entire slave routes across Europe and the Middle East where Viking traders sold captives for silver, spices, weapons, or more slaves. For many unlucky souls, this was a fate worse than death. No freedom, no future, just endless labor, beatings, and fear. There are records of slaves being sacrificed during Viking funerals. That's right, killed to go with their master into the afterlife. Some were burned alive. Others were strangled or stabbed. The Vikings believed that powerful warriors needed servants even in death. So the next time someone calls Vikings noble warriors, remember, they built their power on suffering. Part 7. Erasing Cultures, Psychological War on Identity. The Vikings weren't just physical conquerors. They were psychological ones. When they took over a place, they didn't always build something new. Sometimes they just wiped everything out. They burned churches and temples, destroyed local shrines and statues, killed or enslaved religious leaders, and in some cases, forced people to abandon their gods and follow Norse ones. That wasn't random. It was strategy. When you take away a people's culture, you take away their strength. You confuse them. You isolate them. And eventually you control them. In towns where the Vikings settled, they sometimes forced their own language on the population, changed the local laws, rewrote traditions. That's how the Vikings held on to power without constant fighting. They didn't just kill people. They erased who they were. They turned proud communities into ghost towns. And they made sure the only story left to tell was theirs. Part 8. The Power of Fear, Winning Without Fighting. Here's something wild. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the Vikings didn't always need a raid anymore. Why? Because people were so scared. They just paid to be left alone. That payment was called Danegeld, literally, Dane money. Imagine this. A city sees Viking ships on the horizon. Instead of fighting, they send a messenger with bags of silver and say, "Please don't kill us." And it worked. Sometimes. But the real terror came from not knowing. Would they take the money and leave? Or take the money, then attack anyway? That uncertainty made the fear even worse. The Vikings became like a storm you couldn't predict. And fear became their greatest weapon. They didn't need to be everywhere. They just needed people to believe they could be anywhere. Part 9. Psychological Games. Fear as a master weapon. One of the most terrifying things about the Vikings wasn't just what they did. It was how they made people imagine worse. Sometimes they didn't have to attack. They just had to be seen. Villages along the coast of England and France kept watchers posted on the cliffs. If they saw Viking sails, even far away, Alarms were raised, people ran, and cities braced for war. Some even burned their own crops or buried their valuables to keep them from being taken. But the Vikings weren't always coming. Sometimes they sailed past without stopping. The damage was already done. Fear did the work for them. They also played psychological games with survivors. One brutal tactic? Let one person live. Just one. Not as mercy, but as a messenger. They'd send that person back to their town, bloody, broken, sometimes missing fingers or ears, to tell everyone what they'd seen. Not a message written in ink. A message written in blood and trauma. The result? Whole towns surrendered before a single Viking even stepped on shore. There are records of local rulers agreeing to hand over gold, livestock, weapons, even their own family members, just to avoid a Viking raid. That's how powerful fear can be. And the Vikings mastered it. Part 10. No mercy for traitors or rivals. The Viking Code. Now, the Vikings were brutal to outsiders. But when it came to each other, that could be even worse. Viking society ran on a strict code: honor, loyalty, and strength. If you broke that code, if you betrayed your clan, disrespected a leader, or showed weakness, you didn't get a second chance. You got pain. Traitors were often tortured worse than enemies. They were drowned, burned alive, stoned, buried up to the neck and left to starve, or executed in public. Some Viking sagas tell stories of leaders who made their enemies dig their own graves, or chained them to stones in rising tidewaters. Slow deaths, ugly deaths, purposeful deaths. Rival chiefs who challenged authority were sometimes allowed to fight, but others were captured and humiliated. They'd be paraded around, stripped of weapons, sometimes stripped of clothes, spat on and mocked. Some were castrated, others were tied to poles and left to freeze in the snow. These weren't just punishments. They were lessons. They told every Viking watching, don't challenge the power, or this is what happens. So while Viking raids were feared across Europe, Viking leadership was feared within their own lands. No one was safe, not even their own blood. Part 11, Viking Berserkers, Madness in Human Form. Now let's talk about the most terrifying Viking warriors of all, the Berserkers. These weren't your average fighters. Berserkers were like wild animals, untouchable, unstoppable, completely out of control. They would go into battle wearing animal skins, bear, wolf, or boar. Some wore no armor at all, just rage. Before fights, they worked themselves into a frenzy. How? That part's still debated. Some believe they took hallucinogenic mushrooms or herbs. Others think it was a deep trance, prayer, or just raw adrenaline. Whatever it was, it worked. They would howl, bite their shields, foam at the mouth. Their eyes would roll back. Some claimed they couldn't feel pain, that they were immune to fire and steel while in that state. To their enemies, they didn't look human. And if you were caught by a berserker, you weren't just killed, you were ripped apart. There are stories of berserkers tearing into enemy lines like wolves, smashing skulls with a single swing, roaring like beasts, and not stopping until everyone around them was dead or gone. Even other Vikings were scared of them, and when berserkers weren't in war, sometimes they became bodyguards for kings and chiefs. But they were dangerous to keep around. Stories tell of berserkers turning on their own people when they couldn't control their rage. Some towns banned them entirely. In short, berserkers were weapons, living weapons, and when unleashed, nothing stood in their way. So, after everything we've gone through, after the torture, the terror, the fear, the destruction, it's time to take a step back and ask a bigger question. What kind of people were the Vikings? Really? Were they monsters? Warriors? Survivors? Or something else entirely? The truth is, the Vikings were complicated. They weren't cartoon villains swinging axes for fun, but they also weren't noble heroes sailing around for glory and honor. They were human, just like us, but shaped by a world that was a lot harsher than ours. A world where power meant survival, and fear was a tool just as valuable as a sword. They lived in a time where no one came to save you. You had to protect what was yours, take what you needed, and make sure nobody messed with your name. And the Vikings were masters at doing just that. They learned early on that if people feared you, You didn't have to fight as much. If your enemies believed you were capable of the worst, they'd hand over everything just to be spared. And that's what made the Vikings different. They didn't just fight battles. They built fear. They turned it into a system, a strategy, a reputation that traveled faster than their ships. Think about it. How many groups in history could make entire towns surrender without swinging a single sword? How many left such a deep scar on the memory of Europe that people still tell stories about them more than 1,000 years later? That's real power. And the Vikings knew how to use it. But let's not sugarcoat it. What they did was brutal. They tortured people in ways designed to haunt the mind. They turned humans into property. They destroyed identities, families, cultures. They didn't just raid villages. They shattered them. They broke people mentally, spiritually, and physically. And in many cases, they made sure no one could recover. And yet, here's the strange part. It worked, because the fear they created lasted. It didn't stop when their ships disappeared over the horizon. It didn't end when their kings died. That fear was passed down through generations, carried in whispers, stories, warnings. Parents used to tell their children, "Be good, or the Northmen will come." And kids listened, because they knew those stories weren't just legends. They were memories. That's what sets the Vikings apart from so many other warrior cultures in history. Their violence wasn't just physical. It was psychological. It wasn't just about taking control of the land. It was about taking control of the mind. And once they got inside your head, they didn't need to swing a sword. The damage was already done. But maybe the most disturbing part of all this is how effective it was. Because let's be honest, what the Vikings did works. And that's why it keeps happening throughout history. Not with axes and longships, maybe, but with fear, with control, with messages that say, don't resist, don't fight, just give in. The Vikings weren't the first to use fear like this, and they definitely weren't the last. But they were some of the most memorable. They built an entire era around it, the Viking Age. And even though it ended centuries ago, the stories stayed alive. Not because people liked telling them, but because people needed to. It was a warning, a reminder of what happens when fear becomes a weapon, when people stop seeing others as human, when pain becomes a performance. Now, if you've stuck with me this far, thank you. Seriously, you just sat through a raw, unfiltered look at a brutal part of human history. That's not easy. And that means you're the kind of person who doesn't shy away from the truth, even when it's dark. History isn't always clean. It isn't always noble. And it definitely isn't always fair. But if we ignore the ugly parts, we miss the full picture. And the Vikings, they're part of that picture. A part we can't erase. A part we shouldn't erase. Because even in their violence, there's something to learn. Something about fear, about power, about how far people will go to survive, and how far others will go to control them. That's what makes their story worth telling. Not because we admire what they did, but because we remember it. And in remembering, we learn. So before you go, just think about this. If the Vikings could build an empire on fear alone, what kind of power do we give to fear today? And what would it take to break that cycle? And maybe that's a real lesson here, not just about Vikings, but about us. Because fear doesn't always come with a sword or a war cry. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle. Sometimes it's built with rumors, with threats, with silence. And just like back then, the people who understand how to use fear, how to control people with it, often end up holding the most power. But we have something the victims of the Viking raids didn't. We have knowledge, we have perspective, and we have the ability to recognize these patterns when they show up again in history, in society, even in our own lives. We tell these stories not just because they're shocking or extreme, but because they reveal something deep about human nature, about what people are capable of, both good and bad, when they're pushed to the edge. So as we close this chapter on the Vikings, remember this. They didn't rule because they were the smartest. They didn't win because they were the most organized. They dominated because they understood fear. They crafted it. They used it. They wore it like armor. And in doing so, they carved their name into bones of Europe. But now it's your turn. You've heard the truth. You've seen what history really looked like. Don't let it stop here. Share what you've learned. Challenge the myths. Look beyond the surface. And always ask what's the real story. Thanks for sticking around to the end. You're not just watching history. You're thinking about it. And that's where real power begins.